Ethan Cole had been walking for hours. The path ahead of him was quiet and strange. The trees grew taller than any he had ever seen, their branches curling together, blocking most of the sunlight. The place felt colder with every step he took, and the silence pressed down on him like a heavy weight. His orders had been clear. He had to move into the Forbidden Zone, a place soldiers spoke about only in whispers. No one who entered ever returned. Still, he marched on because his heart told him that turning back was no longer possible. The ground was covered with old stone ruins, pieces of walls and broken statues, half buried in dirt and moss. They told a story of a kingdom that had once been proud, but now was forgotten. Ethan felt the history in every step he took, and it made him walk more carefully. He thought about the people who might have lived here long ago, and wondered why the land had been abandoned. His boots crunched against gravel, and the sound was the only thing keeping him company. Ethan had been raised to serve and protect. His life had been shaped by duty and courage, but this land tested even his steady heart. The Forbidden Zone was not just dangerous because of what others feared about it, it was dangerous because it felt alive. The shadows seemed to move when he was not looking. The air grew heavy when he tried to breathe, and yet something pulled him forward. It was not only duty that kept him walking, it was a strange call, something he could not explain but could not resist. He crossed a wide stone bridge that stretched over a deep valley. Mist rolled up from below, curling around the edges of the bridge and his boots as he moved across. On the other side, he could see the outline of something vast and dark. His eyes narrowed as the shape grew clearer. A palace stood in the distance, its towers rising high, its walls covered in vines. The sight made him pause. He had not expected such beauty in this place of silence and fear. The palace looked both broken and alive, a place waiting for someone to enter. Ethan rested his hand on the hilt of his sword as he took his first steps toward the palace. The gates were tall, made of black iron, and carved with patterns he could not understand. They looked ancient, yet they held a strange light that shimmered faintly. As he stood before them, he felt as though unseen eyes were watching him. The gates creaked softly, and though he had not touched them, they slowly opened. His breath caught in his chest, but he stepped inside, his courage carrying him forward. The air inside the gates felt even heavier. The path led him through a courtyard where stone statues stood in silence. They were shaped like warriors, their faces stern and proud, their armor detailed and lifelike. Ethan could almost believe they had once been alive and were now trapped in stone. He kept walking, though his eyes scanned the shadows around him. Each corner of the courtyard felt like it was holding a secret. At last, he reached the wide steps that led to the grand doors of the palace. They were tall and carved from dark wood, covered with designs that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Ethan stood still for a moment, his heart beating fast. He was a soldier, trained to face danger, yet this place felt different from any battlefield. It was not only a test of strength, but also a test of spirit. His mind told him to turn back, but his heart told him to continue. Lee placed his hand against the heavy wood, and the doors opened without resistance. Warm golden light spilled from inside, shining across his face. He stepped into a great hall where tall pillars reached toward the ceiling. Banners hung from the walls, faded but still showing colors of an old kingdom. The floor was polished stone that reflected the light of torches burning along the sides. The hall was silent, yet the silence was not empty. It felt as though the walls themselves remembered voices that had once filled this place. Ethan walked slowly across the hall, each step echoing. His eyes moved from the banners to the pillars to the long staircase that rose at the far end. He had entered the heart of the Forbidden Zone. Every instinct in him told him this was not just a palace. It was the residence of someone powerful, someone who had been waiting for centuries. He felt the weight of history, the pressure of unseen eyes, and the sense that his journey had only just begun. Ethan Cole stood in the center of the great hall, his boots clicking softly against the polished stone floor. The light of the torches flickered across his armor, making the golden edges glimmer in the silence. He felt the weight of the palace pressing in on him, as if the walls themselves were alive and watching. He had expected ruins, dust, and emptiness, but instead he had walked into a place that still carried power. His heart pounded hard in his chest, and yet he pushed himself forward. Each step was careful, steady, and full of respect for the place he had entered. The long staircase before him rose higher than he had imagined. Each step was carved from white marble, smooth and shining in the torchlight. As Ethan climbed slowly, the silence grew louder, filling his ears until it seemed like a voice of its own. He stopped at the top, where tall doors stood closed. They were carved with patterns of crowns, swords, and roses, as if telling a story of a kingdom that had once ruled with pride. His hand touched the wood and the doors gave way, opening into another chamber. The chamber was vast, wider than the hall below. Tall windows lined the walls, though most were broken, and the moonlight poured in through the cracks. The light mixed with the glow of fire from the braziers set along the sides of the room. At the far end stood a throne, high and grand, carved from dark stone. Drapes of black velvet framed it, and above it hung a broken banner, its colors faded but still proud. The air was heavy, and Ethan felt his breath catch as his eyes locked on the figure seated on the throne. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the arms of the throne. Her gown was black as night, flowing across the steps, and her long silver hair fell around her shoulders. A crown of dark jewels rested on her head, gleaming faintly in the firelight. Her face was calm, pale, and striking, with eyes that seemed to hold the memory of centuries. She watched Ethan with a steady gaze, not with anger, but with something far more powerful. He had entered her palace, and she was the queen who ruled it. Ethan froze, his hand resting again on the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw it. His training told him to be ready, but his heart told him not to act in haste. The queen's eyes met his, and for a moment it felt as though she could see through him, into every memory and every choice he had ever made. Her voice broke the silence, soft and smooth, yet filled with strength. She asked him why he had come, why a soldier dared to step into a place where no man had walked in ages. He took a breath and answered truthfully. He spoke of his duty, of the command that had sent him, and of the courage that drove him forward, even when fear pressed down on him. He told her that he sought no treasure and no power, only the chance to prove himself and honor the path he had chosen. His voice did not shake, though his heart beat fast, and his words filled the chamber like a vow. The queen listened, her face unreadable, her eyes never leaving his. At last she rose from the throne. The long gown swept across the steps as she moved down toward him. Her presence was commanding, yet there was a grace in her every motion. Ethan stood tall, refusing to bow in fear, but he lowered his gaze in respect. When she stopped before him, the air grew heavier still, but there was no threat in her stance. Instead, she studied him, as though measuring his worth. Her hand lifted slightly, and for an instant, he thought she might strike him down. But she only spoke again, saying he had walked into a place where courage was tested, and only those with strong hearts could remain. The torches flickered, and the silence returned. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle over him. He understood that this was not the end of his journey. It was only the beginning, and the queen before him was both the test and the key. He stood still, steady and ready as the palace seemed to close around them, holding their meeting in the depths of its ancient walls. Ethan Cole stood in silence as the queen's words lingered in the air. He felt the weight of her presence pressing against him, and yet something inside urged him not to falter. The great chamber felt colder, though the torches still burned, casting long shadows that shifted with the firelight. The queen's eyes were fixed on him, sharp and calm, and Ethan sensed that his answer had not been enough. He would need to prove his heart with more than words. She turned away from him and walked slowly toward another set of doors at the far side of the chamber. Her gown whispered against the floor as she moved, her crown catching the dim glow. Ethan followed, though each step felt heavier than the last. He knew she was leading him deeper into the palace, but he did not know why. His grip on the hilt of his sword tightened, not in anger but in readiness. He had come this far and he could not turn back now. The doors opened into a long hall lined with mirrors. Their frames were made of silver, and their glass shone even in the dim light. Ethan paused at the threshold, sensing that this was no ordinary place. The queen stopped at the center of the hall and turned to him. Her voice was soft, yet it carried to every corner. She told him that this hall was meant to test those who dared to enter. It was a place where truth and fear would be revealed, and only the strong could stand against what they saw. Ethan stepped inside, and the doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed like thunder. The mirrors shimmered, and for a moment they showed only his reflection. Then, one by one, the images began to change. He saw faces he knew, men and women who had marched beside him in past battles. He saw friends who had fallen and lives he had failed to save. Their eyes accused him, their voices silent but heavy with blame. Ethan's chest tightened, but he forced himself to keep walking. Another mirror showed his childhood home, broken and empty, as if his choices had left it in ruins. He saw the faces of his family fading into the shadows, leaving him standing alone. Pain gripped his heart, but he refused to bow. He reached out and touched the glass, and the image shattered like thin ice, falling to the ground in sharp pieces. The sound was sharp and final, but it gave him strength. As he moved deeper into the hall, the mirrors twisted further. One showed him as a soldier without honor, casting down his sword and abandoning those who depended on him. Another showed him as a man broken by fear, running from the battles he had once sworn to fight. Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his hand tightening on his sword. He struck at the glass, and the false images broke, leaving nothing but shards at his feet. The queen watched in silence as he fought his way through the hall. Her eyes never left him, though her face remained calm as if she had seen this many times before. She did not move to help him, nor did she call him back. This was his trial, and he alone could walk through it. Ethan's steps grew slower as the weight of the illusions pressed against him, but he never stopped. Each mirror that tried to break him only made him stronger. At last he reached the final mirror. This one did not show his past or his fears. It showed only himself, standing as he was now, with his sword at his side, and his face filled with determination. He stared at his own reflection, breathing hard, and for a moment, he wondered what it meant. Then he raised his hand and pressed it against the glass. The mirror shattered without resistance, falling into nothingness. The hall grew still. The mirrors no longer glowed, and the air felt lighter, as if the weight of centuries had been lifted. Ethan lowered his hand and turned back toward the queen. She stepped forward, her eyes steady, and for the first time her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. She told him that few had walked this hall and survived. His strength was not only in his sword but also in his heart. Ethan bowed his head slightly, not in defeat but in respect. He had faced the shadows of his past, and he had not fallen. The trial had ended, but his journey was far from complete. Ethan Cole stood at the end of the hall of mirrors, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breath. Shards of broken glass covered the floor around him, glittering in the dim light like fallen stars. He had faced the visions of fear and guilt, and he had not broken. The queen watched him with her calm eyes, her presence strong yet quiet. For a long moment she said nothing, as though weighing the truth of what she had just seen. Then she turned and gestured for him to follow. Her gown flowed behind her as she moved toward another passage, one that led deeper into the palace. Ethan followed, his boots crunching softly against the stone. The passage was narrow and dark. The torches fewer here, the shadows thicker. He felt the air grow colder, and the silence pressed harder against his ears. At the end of the passage, tall doors carved with the shapes of roses and flames stood waiting. The queen pushed them open, and Ethan stepped into a chamber unlike any he had seen before. It was a vast circle, the ceiling lost in darkness, the walls lined with carvings of warriors and kings. In the center was an open space, marked with a ring of silver. The queen stopped at the edge of the ring and turned to him. Her voice carried softly across the chamber, yet it filled every corner. She told him this was the final trial, a place where strength and courage were tested in ways no words could measure. Ethan listened, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He knew he could not refuse. To walk this path was his choice, and to stop now would mean he had never truly come this far. The moment his boots touched the silver ring, the air changed. Shadows poured from the carvings along the walls, stretching and twisting, until they took the shape of warriors. Their armor gleamed darkly, their swords sharp as the edge of night. They circled him, their silent faces fixed on him as if waiting for the signal to strike. Ethan drew his sword, the steel shining in the dim light, and his heart steadied. He had fought men before, but these were not men of flesh. They were the weight of the past, formed from memory and power. and he had to face them alone. The first shadow warrior rushed at him, its blade cutting fast through the air. Ethan blocked, the clash ringing like thunder through the chamber. He moved quickly, his training guiding his arms, his strength keeping him steady. The second came from behind, and he turned in time to meet it. Each strike felt heavier than the last, but he refused to fall. His sword cut through the shadows, and they broke apart like smoke, only to form again. The trial was not about killing them, but about standing firm, no matter how many came. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Ethan's arms ached, his breath came hard, but his resolve burned bright. Every time the warriors closed in, he struck back with all the force he had, his voice silent but his heart loud. The ring of silver glowed brighter with each clash, as if feeding on his will. He fought until sweat covered his face, and his muscles trembled, but he never let go of his sword. At last, when his strength seemed ready to fail, the shadows froze. They stood still, then faded slowly back into the carvings on the walls. Ethan lowered his sword, his body shaking, but he did not fall. The chamber grew quiet again, and the glow of the ring faded into the stone. The queen stepped forward, her eyes fixed on him, and for the first time her voice carried warmth. She told him he had done what few had ever managed. He had faced fear, memory, and strength, and he had not broken. His trials had ended, and he had proved himself worthy. Ethan bowed his head slightly, the weight of her words pressing into him. He felt not pride, but a deep sense of honor. He had entered the Forbidden Zone as a soldier, but now he stood as something more. The queen's gaze softened. For a moment she looked, not like a ruler bound by shadows, but like a woman who had been waiting for someone who could endure. Their eyes met, and though no words were spoken, Ethan understood that his journey was no longer only his own. It had become part of something greater. Something that reached beyond the walls of the palace and into the heart of history itself. The chamber grew still, after the trial of shadows had ended. Ethan Cole stood with his sword in hand, his chest rising and falling, his body weak but his spirit strong. The silence no longer felt heavy. It was calm, as though the palace itself had accepted him. The queen stepped closer, her gown brushing across the stone floor. Her crown glimmered in the faint light, and her eyes held something he had not seen before. They no longer carried only sorrow, they carried hope. Ethan lowered his sword and bowed his head with respect. He had faced her tests and had not failed. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady and deep. Then she spoke softly, telling him that he had done what few men could ever do. He had shown strength not only in his body, but also in his heart. His courage had broken the silence of centuries. Ethan listened, his heart steady, knowing these words carried meaning far beyond this chamber. She lifted her hand, and for the first time offered it to him. Ethan stepped forward and took it carefully. Her hand was cold, but strong, her touch filled with the weight of all that she was. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken bond formed between them. It was not the bond of ruler and servant, nor of soldier and commander. It was the bond of two souls who had faced darkness and chosen not to bow before it. The queen led him back through the long halls of the palace. The torches burned brighter now, the shadows less heavy. The broken banners seemed to stir gently, as though remembering the wind of old days. Ethan walked beside her, his steps lighter than before. When they reached the great doors of the palace, she paused and looked out toward the courtyard. The statues of warriors stood still in silence, but they no longer seemed threatening. Instead, they seemed to bow quietly to the soldier who had earned his place here. They walked together into the courtyard, and the gates opened without sound. Beyond them, the mist of the Forbidden Zone still curled through the valleys and across the broken stones, but it no longer felt like a curse. Ethan breathed deeply, the cold air filling his chest with life instead of fear. The queen stood beside him, her silver hair shining in the pale light of dawn. For the first time, he saw her not as a figure bound by sorrow, but as a woman who had carried her kingdom's silence alone for far too long. As the sun began to rise, light poured across the land, touching the palace walls and breaking through the mist. The Forbidden Zone did not vanish, but its darkness was lifted by the warmth of morning. Ethan turned to the queen, and she met his gaze. She told him that he had given her what no one else had brought in centuries. He had brought the promise that courage and honor could live again. Ethan said nothing, but his steady eyes told her all she needed to know. They stood together as the light grew stronger. The queen lifted her face toward the sky, and for the first time in countless years, her lips curved into a true smile. Ethan watched her, and in his heart, he knew that his journey had changed not only himself, but also the world he had stepped into. He had entered the Forbidden Zone as a soldier bound by orders, but now he stood as a man bound by something far greater. He had found respect, strength, and a bond that would last beyond time. The silence of centuries had been broken. The palace was no longer only a place of sorrow. It was now a place of hope. Ethan Cole had proved that even in the darkest places, light could be found. He had faced trials that sought to break him, and he had endured. And beside the queen who had once ruled in silence, he had given life to a promise that the future could be brighter than the past. Together, they stood as dawn rose over the Forbidden Zone, the beginning of a new story waiting to be written.